Shri Shuklaji, Mr. Bhargav, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for Dun&Bradstreet to be your host this evening. On behalf of my chairman, Julian Prower, and myself, it is my privilege to be your host today. Over the past 18 years, many of you have attended this function of ours. And over those years, many of our competitors have similar functions that sound like the top 500. And I see a lot of familiar faces here. For all of you, thank you for being back. I see some new attendees here. For all of you, I would say, I hope this evening lives up to your expectations. We have branded this evening's function as Champions of Change. And we've done some proprietary research that helps provide a backdrop for the function. The research we've done is in 4 segments that represent the entire landscape of the Indian economy. And the functions are, and the sectors are manufacturing, services, agriculture, and what we call the new age. The research that we do into these sectors looks into 2 of the main sources of our key capability. One of those is our proprietary database that many of you attending here are actually regular users of. This proprietary database is almost 200 years old. It is almost 300 million in terms of number of entities on our database. And what we maintain is all the interlinkages in this database. The financial, non-financial information, the number of employees, who transacts with who owns shares of who owes how much money to who. In the 1 hour or so since you checked in and had your had snacks and drinks, that database just got updated approximately 2 lakh times. In the course of a day, we get that database updated about 5 million times. The second source of our capability is the macroeconomic research that we do, led by a team of economists whose articles many of you are regular recipients of. Dr. Arun Singh, who needs no introduction. And this economic research covers hundreds of millions of companies across hundreds of countries. And the insights that come out of the database is what we wanted to use as the backdrop for this evening's event. So I'm going to start with manufacturing, as on the top left of your screen. If you are like most of us, you probably consider the manufacturing industry as one of 3 industries, each of whom have their own unique characteristics. The other industries obviously being the services industry and agriculture. The reality, however, is that the manufacturing industry is unique in other ways. As a champion of change, it is actually going to be the most important in India over the next 15 years. And I say that even though as Dun&Bradstreet, we are a part of the services industry. So as we've looked at our research across hundreds of countries, we've represented those countries in the following graphic, and that'll help me explain why the manufacturing industry in its own way is a unique champion of change. So it's a pretty busy slide, and for those of you who are in the back end of the room may not be able to see it, but it represents those hundreds of countries in 3 groups. The 3 groups are countries that are led by the manufacturing industry, countries that are led by the services industry, and countries that are led by the agriculture industry. And on the x-axis, what you find is the Gini index, which represents how egalitarian the country is. Interestingly, the countries that are led by the manufacturing industries are the most egalitarian. In terms of the distribution of wealth, they do the best job of spreading the wealth that is created across all the citizens of the country. So that's in terms of how egalitarian manufacturing-led countries are. The other interesting aspect of manufacturing-led countries is how strong the economies are. So you have the same grouping of countries, and we've created an index that measures the number of years of sustained economic growth. And what you find is that the manufacturing-led economies are the most solid in terms of the growth. They've had typically almost 2 times the number of years of sustained growth as the lowest, which is the agriculture-led economies. So, manufacturing industries as champions of change are key to delivering the most egalitarian societies and the most robust economies. When you look at India, things get even more interesting. So we've gone back about 40 years and looked at our research. And what we find from 1978 onwards is over those 40 years, for every 1% gross value added, the number of jobs created by the agriculture industry, the services industry, and the manufacturing industry looks like this. For every 1% gross value added, the agriculture industry creates no jobs. There is a 0% increase in jobs. The services industry creates 0.4% increase in jobs. The manufacturing industry creates almost twice as many, 0.7% increase in jobs. So if you look out towards 2030, so the next 12 years starting from this point in time, if all 3 industries grow at exactly the same rate, let's call it 6% because that's what we've modeled, a 6% sustained period of growth year after year, then every industry will grow at 6%. In that time, the Indian economy will get 175 million new workers entering the workforce. However, if every part of the economy grows at only 6%, at the end of 2030, there will be 50 million of the 175 million who won't have a job. In order to absorb all 175 million, the manufacturing industry will have to grow at 10% per annum, even if the rest of the economy grows slower and the total economy grows at 6%. So in summary, as champions of change, it's difficult to beat the manufacturing industry. I will talk about the other industries as well. But this is one group of companies that are going to be instrumental in creating a more egalitarian society, a more robust Indian economy, and creating more jobs. For those of you award winners who are present out here, the manufacturing industries in the Dun&Bradstreet Top 500 have created 7 out of every $10 of foreign exchange. They've given 4 out of every $10 of dividends. And for every 10 jobs created in the top 500, the manufacturing industry has created 4 of the jobs. Last year, it was 3. So that's the manufacturing industry. Most of the people seated here are actually from the services industry, which is unique in its own way. So let me talk about the services industry, which is a champion of change in its own way. So what you see here is those hundreds of countries plotted on a chart that lays on the x-axis the percentage of employment provided by the industries, and on the y-axis the productivity of the services employee. And you see the graph kind of looks like, you might call it a boomerang shape or a hockey stick shape. So there's an inflection point somewhere around the 50% mark, when the country has absorbed about 50% of the workforce in services. At that point, suddenly, the productivity of the services industry takes off. If you look at the groupings of of the countries, France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Australia are right at the top. Somewhere just past the inflection point are countries like Brazil and Mexico, who actually we like to consider as comparators of ours. They're actually not. They're way ahead of us in terms of productivity of the services sector. Just at the inflection point is where India is. From the way in which we have modeled it, it appears to us that we are poised for about a doubling of productivity, from about $7,000 to about $14,000 per employee. What happens at that point is that the amount of GDP that goes into research and development, the amount of GDP that goes into training suddenly steps up. Just to give you a sense, R&D goes from 0.5% of GDP to 2.5% of GDP. So that's one interesting aspect of the services industry. The champions of change in the services industry are poised to double the productivity at a rate that no other part of the economy can do and is likely to do. The other aspect of the services industry is the extent of interlinkages between industries, across companies, and of course with citizens. One of the other aspects of the Dun& Bradstreet services that we provide is, if I just look at the last sort of 30 to 35 months, Dun & Bradstreet covers something like 1,000 instances of what we call techno-economic viability studies, TEV. These are distributed across a variety of sectors and typically fall into three categories. The first category is the companies that are making brand new investments. We just call them greenfield projects. The second category are companies who've done that and are successful and are expanding their investments. We call them brownfield projects. And then there's a third category who are companies who have run into problems and are restructuring their debt. We call them restructuring projects. And as Dun & Bradstreet, the last 1,000 projects that we have done cover pretty much the entire gamut of companies in all industries and all three categories of greenfield, brownfield, and restructuring. So we actually see leading indicators of what happens when the services industry is doing well and what happens when the services industry is doing badly, particularly the BFSI sector, the banking and financial services and insurance sector. And the reality is that when things are going well for the services sector, everyone does well. When things are going badly, and we can see that we're running into some of those problems now, the whole economy catches a cold. So, this is a sector that most attendees here know best. The champions of change here are champions because of interlinkages and because of the way in which they are going to be poised to deliver doubling of the productivity. So let me take us from the best known industry to what I consider is probably the least known industry, at least in this room, for the majority of us. And that's the agriculture industry. Now, as the second most populous country and the third biggest economy in terms of purchasing power parity, it's not surprising that India is number one or number two pretty much across the spectrum when it comes to agriculture, because we've got to feed our people. So India is number one when it comes to the production of pulses, milk, jute, spices, the number one exporter of spices, and we're actually number two in a whole bunch of other countries, other parts of the agriculture industry, including fish, rice, sugarcane, fruits, vegetables. Unfortunately, none of this helps the architects of this success, which is actually the Indians that are engaged in agriculture. Now, before I speak about the Indians who are engaged in agriculture, let me tell you a little bit about Indians generally. So take a look at this triangle. If you imagine India is a village of 100 families, most of the people in this room today are representing one family out of the 100. That is 1% of the population. That 1% approximately mirrors the population of Hong Kong. That's only 1%. The next 9 families in that imaginary village represents roughly Central Europe. Most of us in this room interact with that 9% because they are usually the junior colleagues in the companies that we operate in. The next 40%, the next 40 families in that village represent roughly the poorer neighbors of India. In principle, Bangladesh and Pakistan. Most people in this room interact with that aspect of India usually through domestic help. We actually don't interact with them on a day-to-day basis outside that kind of interaction. And 50 families in that village, that's 50% of our population, approximately mirrors the poorest and the most wretched parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Most people in this room actually have no interaction with that 50% of India. The only interaction tends to be what we read in the papers, and we kind of interact with it at an intellectual level, but have no idea what their lives are like. So when companies like Dun & Bradstreet do our research and we come out with metrics about India, I get a lot of you asking me, how is it that we are below Bangladesh in so-and-so metric, or below Pakistan or Sri Lanka, or so many of the African countries? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because 50% of Indians are way below the Southeast Asian, poorer Southeast Asian neighbors that we have in India. Now, unfortunately, as you look at the agricultural sector, there is a very strong overlap between that 50% and the 60% of Indians who actually operate in that sector. That sector earns about 17% of GDP, and even that 17% is actually captured by a very, very small minority, about 1 out of the 60% who are engaged in agriculture. And that part of the economy has very few champions. There aren't many champions of change. Some of you are in this room, and as Dun & Bradstreet and on behalf of the country, we salute you because there aren't many of you. In the 70 years of independence, the rest of us have left behind that 50-60% of the population. The champions of change for them are actually going to come in the future. And they consist of 4 groups of people. 2 of them are the government and the law and order. The government and law and order parts of our ecosystem actually can help them. They can make the policies, and they can provide the law and order cover. They also know who the enemies are, and they're working to fix them, and they will be 2 of the champions of change. The other 2 champions of change are the private sector, the NGOs, and secondly, the intelligentsia and the media, who actually don't know enough about the sector or don't care enough. So the champions of change in this part of the sector, this part of the economy, are going to be the champions of change because they impact the lives of maximum Indians. Their impact will be maximum. And the few awardees that are present in this room today are showing us the way. The final sector of the economy consists of what we call the new age. Now, what you see here is a graphic representation of what's very often referred to as the 4 industrial revolutions. And to just understand what happened in the four industrial revolutions, you have to go back 250 years, when India was part of a peer group of 7 countries. And India was roughly in the middle of those 7 countries. There were only 2 countries ahead of India, France and Britain. So 250 years back, we had the onset of the first industrial revolution, which came through the invention of the steam engine, which first created the power looms that impacted the textile industry, and then later the actual steam engine, the steam locomotive. That was the first industrial revolution. India's ranking, which was 3rd before that, dropped to 4th. The second industrial revolution came with the onset of electricity and mass production. India began its race. Unfortunately, it was a race to the bottom, and unfortunately, India was winning. At the onset of the second industrial revolution, we were running 6th. The third industrial revolution is what's referred to as the digital age, and subsequently the internet. And by then, India was the 7th in the peer group that we started with. Now, what's interesting is that the 4th industrial revolution, which is Internet of Things, cloud computing, artificial intelligence. What's interesting about the 4th industrial revolution is that it has been announced, we know it's coming, and we know what to do to win in it. We know what to do to prepare for it. And there are 2 things that will go into winning in the 4th industrial revolution. And that is how much a country spends on R&D and how much a country spends on staff training. The other interesting aspect of the Industrial Revolution is what happens to jobs. Now, because we're Dun& Bradstreet and because we can look into our database and tell you what happens on jobs, let me tell you what's going to happen on jobs. We get a pretty much regular feed into our database in terms of the number of employees that get created, that get increased or decreased across the entire landscape of countries and companies. What we've found is that overall, we can see whether the overall landscape is increasing in terms of number of employees, and we can see where the spikes are in terms of large amounts of recruitment, and we can see the troughs where large amounts of jobs are being lost. I've modeled that here for India. Take a look at what the landscape shows. Overall, what it tells us is that, and that's not easy to see in the chart, but what it tells us is that, number one, the overall number of jobs is actually going up. And secondly, the peaks are far higher than the troughs. So actually, when it comes to the 4th industrial revolution, there isn't going to be large-scale loss of jobs. It's just going to be different jobs, and there are going to be more jobs. But in order to win, we need to do a better job of training and research and development. Unfortunately, in that, India is at the wrong end of the spectrum and is also moving in the wrong direction. So take a look at this. What you see on the left side of your screens is the percent of R&D spending for India overall compared with other countries. What's positive actually is that the top 500, those of you who are present in this room today, are actually looking a little bit like the peers that we would like to compare ourselves with. You're a little bit short of the UK, China, France, and US, but actually not a long way short compared with how the rest of India is. Unfortunately, when you look at the right side of the screen, the spending on staff training as a percentage of revenue is actually going in the wrong direction. So, the champions of change in the new age economy need to fix that. The benefit we have is that this is the only industrial revolution that has been announced. We know what to do. We just need to do it. So finally, In summary, let me congratulate all the champions of change in this room. Those of you who are in the manufacturing industry, you are the champions of change because you're creating a society and a country that is more egalitarian and an economy that is more robust, and you're creating more jobs. Congratulations to the champions of change in the services industry. You are poised to increase productivity by a bigger amount in a smaller time frame than has ever been seen, just because of the inflection point that India is at. And you're also a champion of change in terms of the interconnectedness. Those of you who are winners here in the agriculture sector, we salute you. You have done more than the rest of us have done for this sector in the 70 years of independence. And those of you who are the champions of change in the new age, congratulations to you, because you are showing us the way in terms of how we can win as a country in the fourth industrial revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again on behalf of Dun & Bradstreet. I hope you have a lovely evening. Do interact with us towards the end of this event and tell us how we can make this program even better for you. Thanks very much and Jai Hind.